The rhythmic, grating scrape of steel on whetstone cut through the pre-dawn chill of the Tower of London, a sound as methodical and final as a death knell. On May 19th, 1536, in the dark hours before the sun would rise on a day that would scar English history, the blade was being prepared. For Anne Boleyn, the once celebrated Queen of England, now a condemned prisoner, each deliberate stroke was a visceral reminder that in mere hours, that same steel would sever her neck from her shoulders. Seated on the edge of her narrow bed, the cold stone walls of her cell seemed to pulse with the frantic rhythm of her own heartbeat. Her hands trembled, not from the morning's cold, but from the crushing weight of knowing. Beyond her window, the sounds of carpenters hammering together the scaffold echoed through the fortress, each blow of their mallets a grim countdown to oblivion. This nightmare, however, had not begun with the accusations of treason or adultery that now stained her name. It had started months earlier, in the bloodied bedsheets of a royal chamber. In January of 1536, Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom King Henry VIII had torn England from the Catholic Church, suffered a catastrophic miscarriage. The loss was devastating on its own, but its timing was catastrophic. The fetus, reported to be male, was lost on the very same day the king was thrown from his horse in a jousting accident, left unconscious for 2 hours. The symbolism was a poison that seeped into the king's mind. As Henry lay near death, so too did Anne's hopes of securing her position through the one thing she had promised him, a male heir. The king, a man of profound ego and superstition, began to whisper that their union was cursed by God. The very theological arguments he had wielded like a battle axe to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon were now being sharpened and turned against Anne herself. The irony was exquisite in its cruelty. Henry, however, was a king who required more than whispers of divine displeasure to rid himself of a wife. He needed legal grounds that would not only destroy Anne but obliterate any sympathy for her, grounds that would not call his own judgment into question. This task fell to his chief minister, the ruthlessly efficient Thomas Cromwell, a man whose survival depended on anticipating the king's every whim. Cromwell began to construct a case so elaborate and damning it would ensure Anne's complete annihilation. The king's growing obsession with the pale, placid Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting who represented everything the fiery and intellectual Anne was not, provided the motive. Cromwell would provide the method. The first thread Cromwell pulled was Anne's relationship with the court musician, Mark Smeaton. Smeaton was young, handsome, and possessed an easy charm that made him popular among the court ladies, a stark contrast to the increasingly bloated and volatile king. On April 30th, 1536, Cromwell had Smeaton arrested and taken to his house in Stepney for interrogation. While no official records survive detailing the specific methods used, what is known is that Smeaton, who had initially denied any improper relationship with the Queen, emerged from Cromwell's questioning a broken man, ready to confess. The timing and nature of his confession suggest a soul shattered by pain and terror, willing to say anything to make the agony stop. His confession, whether true or coerced, became the cornerstone of the case against the Queen. With this single, crucial confession in hand, Cromwell moved with terrifying speed. The net was cast during the May Day celebrations at Greenwich Palace, a festival of spring and renewal deliberately poisoned by betrayal. On May 1st, as jousts and feasts entertained the court, Henry Norris, the king's groom of the stool and one of his closest friends, was arrested. Norris had been with Henry for over a decade, a trusted companion with access to the king's most private moments. His alleged crime was not merely adultery with the Queen, but the highest form of treason, the betrayal of the man who had elevated him to tremendous power and influence. Under interrogation, Norris maintained his innocence with a steadfastness that spoke to either genuine virtue or a clear understanding that confession meant certain death. The arrests continued in a relentless 5-day wave designed to overwhelm and terrify. William Brereton, a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, was taken on May 4th. To the charge of adultery, Cromwell added an additional, more sinister layer: conspiracy to murder the king so that Anne might marry one of her lovers and rule through a puppet husband. The following day, May 5th, brought the arrest of Sir Francis Weston, a young man of 25, recently married, and from a wealthy family. His inclusion was particularly puzzling to contemporaries. A man with everything to live for seemed an unlikely participant in such a dangerous plot. But the arrest that sent true shockwaves through the court, revealing the utter depths of Henry's cruelty, had already occurred on May 2nd. On that day, George Boleyn, Anne's younger brother, and Viscount Rochford, was arrested on charges of incest with his sister. The charge was so monstrous, so beyond the pale of acceptable behavior, that it served a specific, brutal purpose. It transformed Anne in the public imagination from an adulteress into a creature of such profound depravity that no punishment could be too severe. George was everything his sister was: intelligent, cultured, witty, and fiercely loyal to her. By charging him with incest, Cromwell was not just destroying Anne's brother, he was ensuring that no one would dare speak in her defense, lest they be tainted by association with such an unnatural crime. Anne herself was arrested that same day, May 2nd, immediately after returning from watching a tennis match at Greenwich Palace. In a moment of deliberate and savage symbolism, she had been observing Henry play with Francis Weston, the very man who would be arrested 3 days later as her alleged lover. Her final moments of freedom were spent watching the king enjoy himself with a man he would soon have killed for her. The charges were read to her by her own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, a man who now found himself pronouncing the doom of his niece to secure his own survival. Anne's reported reaction was a burst of laughter, not of amusement, but of sheer, stunned absurdity at the charges. But as the full, horrific scope of the accusations became clear, adultery with 5 men, incest with her brother, conspiracy to murder the king, her laughter died, strangled by the chilling reality of her situation. Her journey from Greenwich to the Tower was a pilgrimage through her own ruined triumph. She travelled by barge along the same Thames route she had taken just 3 years earlier during her glorious coronation procession. Then, the crowds had cheered and thrown flowers. Now, they watched in a sullen, ominous silence as the fallen queen passed, surrounded by guards. Upon her arrival at the Tower, the final cruelty was waiting. She was housed in the very same royal apartments where she had stayed before her coronation, forced to confront the ghost of her former glory within the luxurious prison that would now be her final home. The heavy door to Anne Boleyn's prison apartments in the Tower of London closed with a finality that echoed in her soul. The luxurious tapestries and furnishings, remnants of her coronation glory, now felt like a taunt. Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, was under strict orders from Thomas Cromwell to keep a detailed record of her every word and behaviour. A career administrator, Kingston understood his survival depended on providing his superiors with the information they wanted, and his reports would paint a portrait of a queen, psychologically disintegrating under the weight of a conspiracy she could scarcely comprehend. She was a woman caught in a web, and with each passing hour, the strands tightened. The case against Anne and her alleged lovers was not merely about adultery, it was a masterclass in political destruction, designed to be so comprehensively damning that it would justify the most extreme punishment. The charges were a carefully calibrated mix of sexual transgression and high treason, each accusation layering upon the last to create a narrative of a queen so morally bankrupt and politically dangerous that her removal was a necessity of state. The 5 men accused with her were not chosen at random. Each represented a different facet of her influence, and each served a specific purpose in Cromwell's narrative. At the centre of the web was Mark Smeaton, the broken musician. His confession, extracted under circumstances that historians widely believe involved the torture of the corded ropes or the rack, remained the foundation of the entire case. Without it, the accusations would have crumbled into the realm of court gossip. Smeaton, a commoner entirely dependent on royal favour, was the easiest to break, and his admission provided the crucial proof that the Queen had strayed, giving a veneer of truth to the accusations against the higher-born men. Henry Norris, the King's groom of the stool, was a far more significant catch. His arrest sent a chilling message to the entire court. No one, not even the King's closest friend and confidant, was safe. His alleged crime was the ultimate betrayal, not just of his king, but of the deep, personal bond of male friendship. Norris's steadfast refusal to confess, even when offered the possibility of mercy, suggested either remarkable courage or a clear-eyed understanding that his fate was already sealed. His innocence, maintained to the end, was a silent indictment of the entire proceeding. The inclusion of William Brereton, a Welsh gentleman of the Privy Chamber, added a layer of dark conspiracy. By accusing him of plotting to murder the king, Cromwell transformed Anne from a wayward wife into a direct threat to the crown itself. This charge elevated the crime from the personal to the political, justifying the charge of high treason that mandated execution. Sir Francis Weston's arrest was perhaps the most cynical. Young, wealthy, and newly married, he had no obvious motive to risk everything. His inclusion served to illustrate the supposed scale of Anne's depravity, corrupting even those who had no need for her favour, and demonstrated that the net was wide enough to ensnare anyone, regardless of their station or innocence. But it was the accusation against her brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, that revealed the true, Gothic horror of the plot. The charge of incest was so shocking, so beyond the boundaries of human decency that its purpose was clear: to make Anne utterly irredeemable. It painted her as a monster, a creature of such unnatural appetites that her very existence was an affront to God and man. This was not just about destroying a political rival, it was about annihilating her humanity. George was Anne's closest ally, her intellectual equal, and her most fierce defender. By destroying him in this manner, Cromwell severed her most powerful support and ensured that the Boleyn name itself would be forever stained. Within the confines of her Tower apartments, Anne swung between defiance and despair in a heartbreaking pendulum. Kingston's reports detail her conversations, which were often rambling and frantic, as she tried to logic her way out of the impossible situation. She questioned how she could be accused of adultery while constantly surrounded by her ladies, and she famously laughed at the absurdity of the incest charge, pointing out the sheer impossibility of finding private moments for such a crime in the goldfish bowl of court life. Yet beneath this defiance ran a persistent, almost tragic thread of hope. She repeatedly expressed confidence that the king would show mercy, that their shared history and the love they had once felt would ultimately save her. This faith in Henry's essential humanity, so profoundly misplaced, reveals either a fundamental misunderstanding of the man she had married or a psychological defense mechanism too painful to dismantle. One poignant moment, recorded by Kingston, saw her asking if the men who had been arrested were also within the Tower walls. When told they were, she reportedly replied, "I hear say I am accused with them, but they are all false." She then fell to weeping, grappling with the horrifying knowledge that other lives, including that of her own brother, were being destroyed because of their association with her. The psychological torture was exquisite. She was isolated, yet surrounded by the sounds of the fortress that held her alleged co-conspirators, each man a piece in the legal case being constructed for her destruction. Meanwhile, in other cells, the accused men faced their own ordeals. While the nobles like Norris and her brother were likely treated with a degree of courtesy, Smeaton's fate was undoubtedly the worst. The commoner, with no powerful family to shield him, he remained the linchpin of the prosecution. His continued confession, whether born of brokenness, a desperate hope for a quicker death, or genuine remorse, was the engine of the conspiracy. The others, maintaining their innocence, must have known their fate was tied to a case they knew to be fabricated, their loyalty to the Queen or simply their presence in her orbit having signed their death warrants. The machinery of the Tudor state was now fully in motion, and its gears were lubricated with lies and political necessity. The web was complete. A broken musician, a betrayed friend, a minor courtier accused of murder, a doomed young man, and a brother accused of an unthinkable crime. At the center of it all was the Queen herself, trapped in a gilded cage, her spirit fracturing as she awaited the show trials that she must have known were designed for only one outcome. The silence within Anne Boleyn's prison was shattered by the sounds of preparation from Tower Hill, just beyond her walls. On the morning of May 12, 1536, the grim machinery of Tudor justice creaked into its final phase with the trials of her alleged lovers. This was not a search for truth, but a piece of meticulously staged judicial theatre, designed to provide a veneer of legal legitimacy to a political massacre. The proceedings in Westminster Hall were a foregone conclusion, their script written by Thomas Cromwell and approved by a king who had already moved his new bride, Jane Seymour, into apartments a stone's throw from the courtroom. The first to face judgment were the four commoners: Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and Mark Smeaton. They stood accused not merely of adultery with the Queen, a crime against the king's honor, but of conspiring to assassinate the monarch, high treason, punishable by a traitor's horrific death. The evidence presented was flimsy, a tapestry woven from circumstantial threads, a gift from Anne to Norris, a private conversation between the Queen and Weston, Smeaton's tortured confession. The prosecution relied on interpretation and innuendo, building its case on the unstable foundation of court gossip and the desperate words of a broken man. Norris, Brereton, and Weston maintained their innocence with a steadfast courage that baffled their accusers. Facing certain death, they refused to confess, even when offered the faint hope of a commuted sentence. Their silence was a powerful, unspoken testament to the fiction of the charges. Mark Smeaton, however, was the prosecution's star witness against himself and the others. He alone confirmed his guilt, his spirit seemingly crushed by whatever horrors he had endured in Cromwell's custody. His confirmation of the adultery charge was the single piece of concrete evidence the court possessed, and the prosecutors wielded it like a club. The verdicts were as swift as they were predictable. All 4 men were found guilty and sentenced to the full gruesome penalty for treason, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered in a public spectacle of prolonged agony. In a move presented as royal magnanimity but truly designed to avoid creating martyrs, King Henry commuted their sentences to simple beheading, a cleaner, quicker death that served to burnish his image as a merciful ruler, while still achieving his ultimate goal. The most dramatic trial was reserved for George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford. As a peer of the realm, he was tried separately, and he chose to defend himself. A skilled orator and legal mind, George mounted a formidable defense. Contemporary observers noted that his arguments were so compelling, his denials of the monstrous incest charge so forceful, that the jury of his peers seemed genuinely moved and uncertain. For a breathtaking moment, it appeared the meticulously constructed case might crack, that one thread of the web might break. But then, George Boleyn made a fatal error, born of either naivete, desperation to clear his sister's name, or simply a proud man's defiance. He was presented with a piece of paper containing a question he was instructed to read silently. Instead, he read the damning words aloud to the entire court. The question concerned the king's alleged impotence and his inability to satisfy Anne sexually. It was information of devastating sensitivity, a direct assault on the royal virility that Henry VIII held so dear. By speaking it publicly, George had committed a treason far more real than the one for which he was on trial. He had humiliated the king in open court. In that moment, any chance of acquittal vanished. The verdict was guaranteed. George Boleyn was sentenced to die by the axe, a beheading that acknowledged his noble status while condemning him for a crime that shocked the conscience. On May 17th, the 5 men went to their deaths on Tower Hill. Mark Smeaton, his spirit broken, went to the block still professing his guilt, a final tragic performance for the crowd. Henry Norris, William Brereton, and Francis Weston each made final speeches proclaiming their innocence, their words carefully recorded by chroniclers who understood the historical weight of the moment. They died as they had lived their final days, steadfast. Then came George Boleyn. As Anne's brother and her most powerful ally, his death was the true end of the Boleyn ascendancy. His final speech was noted for its eloquence and dignity, a continued protestation of innocence delivered with the grace that had once made him a star of the royal court. The sound of the axe falling 5 times that day would have echoed across the tower, a brutal symphony reaching the ears of the Queen, who was the cause of it all. Confined to her apartments, Anne would have heard the gathering crowds, the solemn pronouncements, the final thud of the axe. The psychological torture of knowing these men, whether friends, acquaintances, or her own beloved brother, had died horrific deaths because of their alleged association with her, must have been an almost unbearable burden. Yet, even as the blood of her so-called lovers soaked into the ground on Tower Hill, Henry VIII was delivering a different, legalistic death blow. The day before Anne's own trial was to begin, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned to Lambeth Palace. There, in a proceeding as swift and predetermined as the secular trials, he pronounced the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn null and void. The grounds were as ironic as they were cruel. Henry, who had broken with Rome to marry Anne, now claimed their union had never been valid because of his previous relationship with her sister, Mary Boleyn. This argument of pre-contract rendered the marriage incestuous and void from the start. The logical contradiction was staggering. The king was simultaneously arguing that Anne was guilty of adultery within their marriage, while also claiming that no marriage had ever legally existed between them. The annulment served 2 coldly practical purposes. It legally erased Anne's status as queen, and it bastardized their daughter, Elizabeth, removing her from the line of succession and clearing the path for the sons Henry hoped to have with Jane Seymour. For Anne, learning of this annulment must have been a final, devastating betrayal. In a single legal stroke, Henry had erased not only their relationship but her entire identity. She was reduced from a crowned queen to a fallen woman who had lived in sin with the king. Her daughter was stripped of her birthright, and the political revolution she had championed was seemingly rendered meaningless. She was now, in the eyes of the law, never the Queen of England, yet she was still to be executed as if she had been one. The machinery of her destruction was now complete on all fronts. Her allies were dead, her marriage was erased, and her trial for treason was next. The legal obliteration of her marriage and the execution of her brother and alleged lovers left Anne Boleyn in a state of profound psychological limbo. She was, according to the Archbishop of Canterbury, never truly queen. Yet she was to be tried as one for crimes committed against the king to whom she was never legally Wednesday. This cruel paradox hung heavy in the air on May 15th, 1536, as she was led into the Great Hall of the Tower of London. The location was significant. By holding the trial within the fortress walls, Henry avoided the risk of a public demonstration in her favor and ensured the proceedings unfolded under the intimidating shadow of the very place she would die. The hall had been transformed into a court of law, a stage for the final act of her destruction. A special commission of 26 peers, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, sat in judgment. These were men who understood the price of defiance. Their own futures and families depended on delivering the verdict the king so clearly desired. Anne entered, pale but composed, wearing a gown of black velvet over a scarlet kirtle, the colors of innocence and martyrdom, a silent rebuttal to the charges she faced. She was accompanied by her ladies-in-waiting, who were there as both comforters and witnesses, their presence a reminder that her every reaction was being documented for the king and for history. Presiding over the trial as Lord High Steward was Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle. The sight of a family member sitting in judgment was the most vivid illustration of the brutal calculus of Tudor politics, where blood ties were severed by the sharper blade of self-preservation. Norfolk's face, reportedly stern and unyielding, betrayed no hint of familial loyalty. He was there to perform a duty, and his performance would be flawless. The charges were read aloud in all their lurid, specific detail. Anne was accused of adultery with Henry Norris on October 6, 1533, at Westminster, with William Brereton on November 8, 1533, also at Westminster, with Francis Weston on May 20, 1534, at Westminster, and with Mark Smeaton on April 26, 1536, again at Westminster. The very precision of these dates and locations was intended to lend credibility, but to a discerning ear, it revealed the fabricated nature of the case. The specificity was too perfect, too convenient for prosecutors who needed to construct a timeline of misconduct. The charge of incest with her brother George was dated to November 2, 1535, at Westminster Palace, a time when Anne was likely still recovering from her final, tragic miscarriage, a detail that made the accusation seem not only monstrous but implausible. The most serious charge, that she had conspired to imagine and compass the death of the king, and had promised to marry one of her lovers after his death, was the necessary foundation for the charge of high treason. Without it, her other alleged crimes might have been seen as moral failings, not acts demanding her execution. When given the opportunity to speak, Anne rose to her feet. Her voice, according to contemporary accounts, was clear and steady, carrying across the silent hall. She faced her accusers and the jury of her peers with a regal dignity that impressed even her enemies. One by one, she denied every charge laid against her. She defended her conduct with Henry Norris, explained away the gifts she had given to Francis Weston as mere tokens of royal favor, and met the grotesque accusation of incest with a calm and absolute denial. Her defense, however, was hamstrung from the start. As a woman and a subject, she had no right to legal counsel, could not call witnesses in her own defense, and could not cross-examine those who testified against her. She was a lone voice in a proceeding meticulously engineered to convict her. The evidence presented by the prosecution was a fragile construction of hearsay and circumstantial gossip. Servants and courtiers testified to having seen meaningful glances or overheard fragments of private conversations. The prosecution relied on interpretation and innuendo, building its case on the unstable foundation of court malice. One particularly damning, yet unverifiable, piece of testimony came from Lady Wingfield, who was conveniently deceased by the time of the trial and could not be challenged on the specifics of her alleged knowledge. The speed of the trial was itself an indictment of its fairness. The entire case presentation, defense, and deliberation was concluded in a single day, leaving no time for careful consideration or for any unexpected truth to emerge. When the time came for the jury to retire, there was no suspense. The 26 peers, including men who had once bowed and scraped for her favor, filed out to deliberate. Their return was swift. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The Duke of Norfolk, his voice perhaps trembling with either genuine emotion or well-practiced sorrow, pronounced the sentence. His words were formulaic and brutal. Anne Boleyn was to be returned to the Tower and burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure. The option of burning, the traditional punishment for female traitors, was left on the table, but the alternative of beheading was presented as the king's mercy. It was a mercy that served Henry's purpose, avoiding the horrific spectacle of a queen burning at the stake, which might have generated public sympathy. Anne's reaction to the sentence was witnessed by all and recorded for posterity. She received the news of her condemnation with what observers described as a superhuman composure. She raised her hand and swore an oath. "I am innocent of all the charges laid against me. I have always been a faithful and loyal wife to the king." She then, in a final act of political acumen, or perhaps genuine concern for the soul of the man who had condemned her, added, "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." Her words, whether heartfelt or strategic, were her last public performance as queen. She had maintained her dignity to the very end, refusing to grant her accusers the satisfaction of seeing her break. She was then escorted from the hall, no longer a defendant but a condemned woman, her fate now a matter of mere scheduling. The verdict was a formal death warrant, but the days that followed Anne Boleyn's trial were a peculiar, suspended agony. Returned to her apartments in the Tower, she was now a woman living on borrowed time, the sentence of death hanging over her like a shroud. Her faith that Henry would grant a last-minute reprieve finally shattered, replaced by a grim and clear-eyed resolve. Her final days became a meticulous preparation for death, a performance she was determined to control with the same precision she had once managed her royal household. She swung between fervent prayer, desperate to save her immortal soul, and practical arrangements for the earthly spectacle of her execution. Her primary concern was for her daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, and now officially branded a bastard. Anne's requests for a final farewell were denied, another calculated cruelty that severed her last maternal tie. She then turned her attention to the logistics of her death. When informed that the king, in a final gesture of so-called mercy, had commuted her sentence to beheading and had imported a skilled swordsman from Calais to ensure a clean stroke, she received the news with calm acceptance. The French sword was reputedly faster and more reliable than the clumsy English axe, and Anne, ever the pragmatist, was likely grateful for this small dignity. She even practiced kneeling in the correct position, instructing her weeping ladies to adjust her posture so the executioner would have a perfect target. The morning of May 19th, 1536, dawned grey and damp, the mist from the Thames clinging to the Tower walls as if nature itself mourned. Anne had slept little, spending her final night in prayer with her almoner. She rose and dressed with deliberate care, selecting a dark grey damask gown with a white kerseymere underskirt. The colours were a silent, powerful statement, grey for mourning, white for innocence. Over this, she wore a loose, ermine-trimmed robe. Her famous dark hair was bundled neatly under a simple white cap, a practical measure to expose her neck. She was no longer dressing as a queen, but as a soul preparing to meet its maker. Sir William Kingston arrived at her door with the formal summons. Her composure was absolute. "I am ready," she stated calmly, and followed him out into the cool morning air. The walk to the scaffold on Tower Green was short but immense, each step a lifetime. She was led past curious, silent guards and a carefully selected audience of court officials and London citizens. The scaffold itself was a low, wooden platform, strewn with fresh straw to soak up her blood. Upon it stood the black-hooded, anonymous figure of the executioner, and beside him, the block. A strange, expectant hush had fallen over the crowd. The execution of a queen was an unprecedented event, and the atmosphere was thick with a mixture of horror, pity, and morbid fascination. Anne mounted the steps with a steady grace that astonished all who saw her. Turning to face the crowd, she delivered the final speech custom demanded of all condemned traitors. Her voice was clear and carried easily in the still air. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die," she began, "for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." She carefully acknowledged the king's justice while subtly separating it from divine judgment. She then continued, "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler and more merciful prince there never was." The irony of these words was surely not lost on her, but they were necessary to protect those she left behind, especially her daughter. She concluded by commending her soul to God, asking for prayers, and stating firmly, "I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me." There were no grand declarations of innocence, no fiery denunciations of Henry. Her speech was a masterpiece of restraint and political intelligence, designed to project dignity and acceptance, leaving a legacy of grace rather than defiance. After she finished, she gave a small purse of gold coins to her chief attendant to distribute to the poor, a final act of charity. Then, With the help of her weeping ladies, she removed her headdress and ermine robe. She blindfolded herself with a white linen cloth, the final act of a woman in control of her own narrative until the very end. Kneeling upright in the practiced position, she repeated in a firm voice, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesu, receive my soul." The black-hooded executioner, who had hidden his sword in the straw, needed no signal. He stepped forward, and in one swift, silent, circular motion, the French blade flashed through the air. The stroke was so swift and precise that many in the front rows claimed they saw her lips still moving in prayer after her head had fallen. The crowd let out a collective, stunned gasp. It was over. The life of Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, had been extinguished with terrifying efficiency. Her ladies, shrouded in grief, rushed forward with the white cloths they had prepared, gathering her head and body with tender reverence. She was buried that same day in an unmarked grave within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, laid to rest in an old arrow chest near the bodies of her brother and the other executed men. There was no ceremony, no monument. Henry VIII, displaying a callousness that stunned Europe, was hunting at Hampton Court that morning. Just 11 days later, he married Jane Seymour. The king had moved on, but the ghost of the woman he had erased had only just begun her long, indelible haunting of English history. Thank you for following this tragic chapter of history with us. If you were moved by the story of Anne Boleyn, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden truths of the past. We are so grateful to have this community of history lovers, connecting across time and space through our shared curiosity.